I'm Isaiah Maldonado here with Lyle at Beaver Stadium after number 3 Penn State was knocked off 30-24 in overtime against number 6 Oregon. Lyle, this was a grueling loss. If we just look back at everything else, we saw Penn State, Drew Allar's final interception. Offense was slow to get going. James Franklin is now 4-21 against top 10 teams during his time at Penn State. What does this spell out for the program going forward?
Yeah, I want to. You mentioned it. James Franklin could not win the big game. It's the whole narrative, which he said it today. I get the whole narrative, and then he corrected himself. He's like, it's not actually narrative because it's factual. I get it. He struggles in these ranked matchups, And to start, it looked like Penn State had no chance on this one. But his team battled back. That second half surge is down 17-3, but they just can't come out on top. Earlier in the week he talked about how this was going to be a true 4-quarter game, and it ended up being more than 4 quarters, right down to the wire. These are two of the best teams in the country. We didn't really know what Penn State was going to look like going into this one, and at first we thought that they were not going to be able to hang it all. The Ducks came out hot. They were in control. But James Franklin, man, he walked off that field. There was some boos, and it wasn't as bad as it was last year at Ohio State when the fans were, yelling at him right there in that student section, and he went right back and tripped right back at him. But he stood motionless post-game, stared out into the distance, had his hand, hugged his daughter. Drew Allar denied Dennis-Sutton, Nick Dawkins all backed him up post-game. But at the end of the day, this is a defining loss for him. He's got one more shot at this thing later in the year against Ohio State. You can argue maybe when Indiana comes to town and after that, but later you're going to see the Buckeyes first, a team that he hasn't beat since 2016, and Penn State hasn't beat at Columbus in 2011. He had an opportunity today and you just couldn't capitalize on it.
I mean, honestly, going forward, we really have to have these conversations about, is it Penn State's offensive talent, or is it the structure of Penn State's offensive identity? Because time and time again, we've had these situations where they just can't finish in the big moment. They're constantly relying on these other guys to step up. They're not able to step up. We saw Devontae Ross have a great game today, 2 touchdowns, but came alive at the fourth quarter. We need that energy, or Penn State needs that energy consistently throughout the entire game. We saw when James Franklin was talking about it, saying that, or earlier in the year, or a couple weeks ago, he said that we want our receivers to be able to have great individual games, but we also want them to be able to come together and have a productive all-around day, and that wasn't the case today. Trevor Pena had a couple of big plays. Kyron Hudson made a play or two, but overall, Luke Reynolds was relatively quiet. Khalil Dinkins quiet, and not too much offensive production from the tight end position. Penn State needs to get more value out of all of their pieces, and whether that starts top to bottom with restructuring how they run their offense, whether it's a Drew Allar problem, I think going forward, these are going to be very valid questions that we have when it comes to talking about Penn State's offense.
Yeah, you mentioned it. I think we got to start with Drew Allar. We saw a vintage Drew Allar game today. Looked really bad, missed a bunch of throws, and then he stepped up. That drive they had in the second half to score, to cut that lead to 1 touchdown. He fired that pass off to Luke Reynolds, and then had that beautiful deep ball to Devontae Ross, like you mentioned, 35-yard touchdown. And then he battled back. He led that drive down the field, a couple 4th down conversions that they had, really methodical to tie it up late. And, but then you saw, where he comes to show in those late games. Game-sealing interception. You saw it in the Big Ten Championship, Oregon last year. You saw it against Ohio State, had that crucial one at the end of the half. You saw it against Notre Dame, that game-sealing interception. It was really just the vintage prime. You saw why Drew Allar is so highly regarded as a prospect college quarterback, why people are so skeptical as if he could lead this team to the big moment and even pursue an NFL career in the future. But, we saw highs and lows, Drew Allar. Obviously it was mainly lows today. Post-game, you're talking to him. Obviously, as always, emotional, very frustrated. Asked what went wrong. The answer was, they didn't win. Obviously, James Franklin cited a bunch of things offensively, struggled on first down, put in some deep distances. But I just want to say it was all offensive issues, to be honest, in this one. I think I look at the run game did not get going. You mentioned the wide receivers. Other than Devontae Ross late in the first half, the transfers, obviously you exclude Liam Clifford because he's been a non-factor this year. 3 catches for 10 yards in that first half. I don't think Kyron Hudson even had a catch today. Don't quote me on that one. Offensive line, they gave up a bunch of pressure. That Oregon D-line really got to them early. And the wide receivers didn't create any separation. Offense really didn't get going. And if Drew's not playing your game, you need these other things to help balance that out. But overall today, just nothing was going. Andy Kolnicki's play calling until those 2 touchdown drives to tie the game up, it was horrendous. You took Drew out of the game with a wildcat to get him out of rhythm. Just a bunch of questionable plays. And then obviously you make it back up with that great play, touchdown, the Devontae Ross, and everyone's going to forget about it. But they shouldn't forget about it. This was not Andy Kolnicki's day today. This Oregon defense has improved way better than last year, but this is a defense that he torched last year, and he did not do that today.
So, we spoke about Penn State's offense. Defensively, as you mentioned, there was a lot of positives, as there typically is. We typically don't come on here and question what's going on with a Penn State defense. Saki Wheatley, A.J. Harris. It's honestly the first game we really got to see A.J. Harris. And aside from that one kind of fumbled toss-up with the pick when he was guarding the Corey Moore that many would argue, I would argue, that he probably should have gotten, and it still ended up being a reception by Corey Moore. He played overall a very solid game. The secondary looked very solid. We could argue that we probably could have seen a little bit more production from Penn State's defensive front. Obviously, Dennis-Sutton came alive a little bit in the end with the interception on the two-point conversion. We saw Zane Durant have a couple of solid plays. Xavier Gilliam had a couple of solid plays. But overall, this Penn State Penn State defensive front didn't get a single sack, which is very uncharacteristic for a team that kind of prides itself on being able to get to the quarterback, make his life hell. And Dante Moore played an amazing game when the lights are brightest here in Beaver Stadium against a stadium that has 111,000 plus fans. So to be able to have that level of execution, I wonder if it's a question of, once again, is Oregon really that good of a team? Or could we have seen a better effort from this Penn State defensive front and overall defensive effort?
Yeah, I mean, they started really well. They honestly kept Penn State in the game in that first half. I just think they got tired, to be honest. You mentioned no sacks. That doesn't mean there was a lack of pressure. Zariah Fisher and Dennis-Sutton, they had their chances. Alonzo Ford, you mentioned Dante Moore. He was really good rolling out of the pocket today. Did not get rattled. And that Penn State defensive line, those are some scary dudes. Zane Durant and Dennis-Sutton would not want to mess with them, but a lot of poise from him today. This was the biggest game of his young career, obviously. Started at UCLA, transferred out to sit behind Dylan Gabriel for moments just like this. He looked really good today, made a couple of big-time throws. And that's the difference between, you look at Dante Moore compared to Drew Allar. Dante Moore completely outplayed him, and that defense just got tired. A couple big runs, Noah Whittington. Corey Moore got free on a few plays, Kenyon Sadiq. And ended up just being the difference in this one, methodically moving the ball down the field. They went quiet in the second half when that Penn State offense came alive. So that's the reason why this game went to overtime. But then, obviously, we don't hit on that defense. That touchdown they had to Jameer Johnson in the second overtime, that was first play. Right away, they scripted that thing beautifully, got right in the end zone. And that ended up being the difference maker, because you had the momentum going that second overtime. The Penn State's defense just, they wanted to get another opportunity back on the field. Or even end that, so the offense could go ahead and win the game. They didn't do that. Drew Allar interception. Defense, you highs, lows. At the end of the day, Jim Knowles played this Oregon team twice last year in his Ohio State. The first time it did not go very well. Second time in the playoffs, it went very well. So, you could point out a few different things, but at the end of the day, this offense ended up being the difference. This defense, if you're Penn State, you should not be worried moving forward. The offense, kept them on the field longer than they should have. The rotation shortened up today, and I think you saw some lapses because of it.
We've looked at the team. We looked at Penn State's effort as a collective. We looked at Oregon's effort as a collective. But now going forward, where do we think Penn State is going to be ranked after this loss, and how do we think they can bounce back moving forward? I'll go first. I could see Penn State dropping a significant bit. Obviously, a loss to the team. I believe Oregon peaked at number 4 this year. So still a very, very high-tier program, even at number 6 right now, still one of the best teams in college football. I could see Penn State probably falling to around number 6, anywhere from 6 to 8. I think definitely there's going to be questions around, LSU just lost, so there was a lot of other losses that can cause things to fluctuate, but I think Penn State is definitely knocked out of the top 5. I think that going forward, you mentioned the game against Indiana, their games against Ohio State. Those are the 2 games that are going to be those season-defining, will allow them to climb back up in the rankings. How do we feel about them moving forward, and where do you think they'll be currently after this loss to Oregon?
Yeah, I like what the numbers you just said, 6 to 8, they're going to fall. Oregon's going to surpass them by a few seeds. But, this is just one. Honestly, you can make an argument that you saw 2 of the best teams in the country today, whether you feel like either of those teams actually played like that. Penn State had a weak non-conference schedule, or Oregon also had a weak non-conference schedule. I think, obviously, their strength of schedule was a little more competitive than what Penn State had, because Northwestern, Big Ten team, they won that game by about 2 scores, so there's also that. But, just going forward, this Penn State team is just, they've got a couple challenges up ahead. But, they've got some games to bounce back. UCLA, that should be a bloodbath. They should get everything figured out by then. But, they got to come ready to play. This team, obviously, you can still make the playoffs with 2 losses if they're going to be Oregon and Ohio State. You saw 4 Big Ten teams make the playoff last year, but they don't want that loss. They want to comfortably get in there with an 11-1 record moving forward. A lot of fans going into this year, not just fans, college football, media, and everything, they expected 11-1 with one of those losses going to be to Oregon and Ohio State. Right now, this game against the Buckeyes is trending to be in favor of Ohio State. But, that's Halloween weekend. They got some things to iron out before then. Long road ahead.
This definitely doesn't spell the end of Penn State's season. So you will catch me and Lyle back when Penn State plays UCLA. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.